Most people who grew up in the 1970s with very little money had no idea they were poor. Back then, everyone around them seemed to live the same way, so it all felt completely normal. But looking back now as adults, the signs are crystal clear. If you recognize even half of these experiences, you definitely grew up poor in the 70s. And honestly, you probably turned out tougher because of it. Growing up poor in the 70s was like living in a completely different world compared to today. Families had to get creative with everything. Money was tight, but people found ways to make things work that seem almost impossible now. The thing is, kids back then didn't know any different. They thought everyone lived exactly the same way they did. Let me paint you a picture of what life was really like for families struggling financially in the 1970s. These weren't just minor inconveniences. These were the daily realities that shaped an entire generation of kids who learned early that you make do with what you have, fix what's broken, and never waste anything that might still be useful. The most obvious sign you grew up poor in the 70s was the state of your family's television set. Almost every household had that one TV where the channel knob had broken off months or even years ago. Instead of spending money they didn't have on a repairman or a whole new television, families would grab a pair of pliers and keep them permanently on top of the TV set. Those pliers became as essential to watching television as the remote control is today. Changing channels became this careful, almost surgical operation. Everyone in the house learned the exact technique needed to make it work. The youngest kids would often get stuck with channel-changing duty because they had the steadiest hands and the most patience. You'd slowly click through the channels, hoping to land on one that came in clear. Sometimes the picture would be fuzzy, or the sound would cut out randomly, but you made it work. The idea of complaining about poor reception when you could barely afford to keep the lights on was ridiculous. You were grateful to have any television at all, even if it meant using pliers and dealing with static. Food shopping was a completely different experience when money was tight. Your family regularly shopped the day-old bread shelf at the grocery store. This wasn't occasional, it was standard practice. The bread was usually just slightly less soft than the fresh loaves, but it was perfectly fine for making toast or sandwiches, and it cost a fraction of the regular price. When the store had name-brand bread marked down to the day-old price, that was considered a lucky find. Your mom would stock up, sometimes buying 4 or 5 loaves at once if they were cheap enough. She'd freeze what the family couldn't eat immediately. Nobody thought of it as eating inferior food. It was just practical. Why spend extra money on bread that would taste exactly the same once you toasted it, or made it into a peanut butter and jelly sandwich? Your parents knew exactly when they got paid and would time their check writing accordingly. Writing a check before payday wasn't reckless spending. It was strategic financial management. They knew it would take a day or two for the bank to process the check, which gave them just enough time for their paycheck to clear. Shopping with your parents meant watching them mentally calculate running totals as they put items in the cart. They'd add up prices in their heads, sometimes putting things back if the total was getting too high. Shoes were another dead giveaway that money was tight in your household. Most kids had exactly 2 pairs of shoes. One good pair for special occasions like school pictures or church, and one worn-out pair for everyday use. The good pair had to last sometimes through an entire school year, so they were only worn when absolutely necessary. Payless, Kinney, and Kmart shoes were staples in households trying to stretch every dollar. These weren't fashion statements, they were practical necessities. The good pair would be carefully preserved, sometimes wrapped in tissue paper or kept in the original box to protect them. Meanwhile, the everyday pair would be worn until they literally fell apart. Kids would wear shoes with holes in the soles, thin spots worn through the fabric, or laces that had been knotted back together multiple times after breaking. The idea of throwing away shoes just because they looked worn was wasteful when there wasn't money for replacements. Your parents became experts at extending the life of shoes. They'd use cardboard inserts to cover holes in the soles, duct tape to hold pieces together, or even stuff newspaper inside if the shoes were too big. These repairs weren't temporary fixes while waiting for new shoes. They were permanent solutions because new shoes simply weren't in the budget. Clothing in general followed the same philosophy. Wearing patched clothes wasn't unusual or embarrassing. It was normal. When jeans developed holes at the knees or shirts got tears, Parents would sew on patches instead of throwing them away. Iron-on patches were popular because they were easy to apply and relatively inexpensive, but many families couldn't even afford those. Instead, your mom or grandmother would cut pieces of fabric from old clothes or sheets and sew them on by hand. The patches rarely matched the original color or fabric perfectly, but that didn't matter. The goal wasn't to make the clothes look new, it was to make them functional for as long as possible. Older siblings' clothes would be passed down to younger ones, regardless of gender sometimes. A shirt or pair of pants might go through 3 or 4 kids in a family before it was finally too worn out to repair again. Even then, the fabric might be salvaged to use as patches for other clothes. Your family car told its own story of financial struggles. It wasn't uncommon for the family vehicle to have serious mechanical problems that went unfixed for months or even years. If the battery was weak or the starter wasn't working properly, push-starting the car became a regular family activity. One person would sit in the driver's seat while everyone else lined up behind the car to push. You'd push until the car was rolling fast enough. Then, the driver would pop the clutch, and hopefully, the engine would catch and start running. This process might need to be repeated every single time the car was driven, but it was cheaper than paying for repairs. The car might have other issues too. Windows that wouldn't roll down, air conditioning that didn't work, or a radio that only picked up 1 or 2 stations. These weren't just minor inconveniences that would eventually be fixed. They were permanent conditions that the family learned to live with because car repairs were expensive luxuries. Sometimes, the car would make terrible noises, leak fluids, or have other obvious problems that would send modern families straight to a mechanic. But in the 70s, if the car still ran and could get you where you needed to go, you kept driving it. The philosophy was simple. If it ain't completely broken, don't spend money fixing it. Government assistance programs provided help, but it came with its own set of challenges and social stigmas. Families would receive large blocks of processed cheese and containers of powdered milk through various federal programs. You'd mix it with water, according to the directions, and store it in the refrigerator, but it never tasted quite like real milk. It was thin, slightly off in flavor, and left a weird aftertaste. But it was free, and it provided nutrition that growing kids needed, so families made it work. These government commodities weren't fancy or particularly appetizing, but they helped stretch grocery budgets during the toughest months. Some families would try to use these ingredients creatively, mixing the powdered milk into recipes where the taste would be less noticeable, or finding ways to make the processed cheese more appealing to kids who might otherwise refuse to eat it. The social aspect of receiving government assistance was complicated. While the food was helpful, there was often shame or embarrassment associated with needing help. Parents would sometimes send kids to pick up commodities to avoid being seen themselves, or they'd go during off-peak hours when fewer neighbors might be around. Holidays and birthdays presented special challenges when money was extremely tight. Gift giving became an exercise in creativity rather than spending power. Many families got creative with wrapping paper, because buying expensive gift wrap seemed wasteful when the paper would just be torn off and thrown away. The comic section from Sunday newspapers became colorful, free wrapping paper. Kids actually looked forward to seeing their presents wrapped in the funny papers because it was cheerful and unique. Brown paper grocery bags were cut up and used as wrapping paper, sometimes decorated with crayons or markers by younger children to make them more festive. These homemade wrapping solutions weren't seen as cheap or inadequate. They were seen as resourceful. The focus was on the thought and effort that went into the gift itself, not the presentation. A present wrapped in comics or decorated brown paper could be just as exciting to unwrap as anything wrapped in store-bought paper. Parents might start shopping for Christmas presents in July, buying one small item at a time when they found good deals. Birthday presents were often practical items that the child needed anyway: new socks, underwear, or school supplies dressed up as gifts. Kids from families with very little money often found ways to contribute financially, even at young ages. Collecting glass bottles for the deposit refund was a popular way for children to earn small amounts of spending money. Every soda bottle and beer bottle was worth a few cents when returned to the store, so kids would search neighborhoods, parks, and roadsides looking for discarded bottles. Paper routes were another common way for kids to earn money. Getting up before dawn to deliver newspapers before school taught responsibility, and provided a small but steady income. The money wasn't much, maybe a few dollars a week, but it was enough to buy candy, save for something special, or even contribute to family expenses in small ways. Babysitting younger children in the neighborhood was another opportunity for older kids to earn money. Even 11 or 12-year-olds would babysit for neighbors, earning $1 or $2 for several hours of watching toddlers or young children. This was seen as normal and appropriate, kids helping other families while earning a little money for themselves. These small jobs taught children about the value of money and the importance of working for what you wanted. They also provided practical life skills and a sense of independence that many modern children don't develop until much later in life. Winter presented special challenges for families without much money, especially when it came to keeping kids warm and dry. Bread bags became makeshift waterproof liners for shoes and boots when proper winter gear wasn't affordable. If your shoes had holes or weren't insulated enough for cold weather, you could slip a plastic bread bag over your socks before putting your feet in your shoes. The bread bags would help keep your feet dry when walking through puddles or snow, though they weren't particularly comfortable. They would bunch up inside your shoes and make your feet feel sweaty, but they were better than having cold, wet socks all day. This solution was temporary at best, and the bags would tear or develop holes after a few uses. But new bread bags were constantly available as families went through loaves of bread. It became routine to save every bread bag specifically for this purpose, washing them out and keeping them stored for the next time they were needed. The sight of kids with bread bags on their feet wasn't unusual or embarrassing in neighborhoods where many families were struggling financially. It was just one of many creative solutions that parents came up with to solve problems without spending money they didn't have. School presented its own set of challenges and reminders about financial differences between families. The book fair was a perfect example of how economic realities played out in educational settings. When the colorful flyers came home advertising all the amazing books available for purchase, kids from families without extra money would still participate in the dreaming part. They'd grab pencils and circle all the books that looked interesting, creating elaborate wish lists of everything they hoped to buy. Often, though, there wasn't money available for book purchases, no matter how educational or worthwhile they might be. Sometimes, parents would scrape together enough for one small book, or maybe just a bookmark, but many times, kids would attend the book fair empty-handed. Even without buying anything, the book fair was still exciting. Kids could browse through all the books, read the backs of paperbacks, and imagine what stories might be inside. They'd make mental notes of titles they wanted to remember, so they could look for them at the library later. The social dynamics at school book fairs could be awkward for kids who couldn't afford to buy anything. Watching classmates purchase stacks of books while you could only look was a stark reminder of economic differences, though most kids didn't fully understand the implications at the time. School lunch programs provided another daily reminder of financial status. If you showed up at school without lunch money or a packed meal from home, the school would provide a basic meal, usually a plain peanut butter sandwich and a carton of milk, if you were lucky. This emergency lunch was dry, basic, and not particularly appetizing, but it was better than going hungry. Kids who regularly received these emergency lunches learned not to complain about them. They'd eat quietly and quickly, trying not to draw attention to the fact that they were eating different food than their classmates. Most understood intuitively that their families were struggling and didn't want to create additional problems by being difficult about food. The free lunch program helped many families, but it also created visible distinctions between kids who could afford to buy lunch and those who couldn't. The process of getting free lunch often involved paperwork and qualification processes that reminded families of their financial situation regularly. Home heating and cooling were areas where families had to make difficult choices between comfort and affordability. The thermostat in most households struggling financially was strictly off-limits to children. If you complained about being cold, you were told to put on a sweater. Leaving doors open, even for just a few seconds, would result in sharp reminders from parents who were trying to keep utility bills as low as possible. Kids learned quickly that comfort was secondary to keeping the electric or gas bill affordable. These rules weren't meant to be harsh. They were practical necessities for families living on tight budgets. Kids who grew up poor in the 70s learned early that you could have fun and be happy without spending lots of money, and that fixing things was usually better than replacing them. These experiences shaped an entire generation of people who learned to be self-sufficient, creative problem solvers, who didn't expect things to be handed to them. They learned the value of hard work, the importance of not wasting anything useful, and how to find joy in simple pleasures. The funny thing is, most kids who lived through these experiences didn't feel deprived or sorry for themselves at the time. This was just normal life, and they assumed everyone else lived pretty much the same way. It's only with adult perspective that the signs of financial struggle become obvious, and the creativity required to make everything work becomes impressive. These memories aren't necessarily painful to look back on. They're often remembered with fondness because they represent family togetherness, creative problem solving, and simpler times when happiness didn't depend on having lots of money or fancy things. If you recognized yourself in most of these situations, you definitely grew up poor in the 70s, but you also grew up learning skills and developing character traits that probably served you well throughout your life. Drop a comment and let me know which of these hit closest to home for you. I bet there are some I missed that were part of your experience too.